Well, good morning, all.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Everybody doing well? Jane, it's great to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Good. Well, I want to start off today by telling you that this next section in Ruth that we're going to look at, verses 15 through 22, is really an incredible study in contrast. This is almost like country western music. Country western music, as you know,
What did he say? Almost found.
most country western music is you lost your girl, you lost your truck, you lost your dog.
Yeah.
And if you play them backwards, you get your dog back, you get your wife, your girlfriend back, you get your truck back. That's the contrast. You can hear it forward and lose everything. You can hear it backwards and gain everything. Well, this particular section really, it's going to bring home a huge series of contrasts. There's going to be a contrast between Yahweh and the God of Moab. There's going to be a contrast between Ruth and Naomi. There's going to be a contrast between Ruth and Orpah. There's going to be a contrast between Naomi and the women of Bethlehem. There's going to be huge contrast in response, in how Naomi responds to her circumstances and Ruth responds to her circumstances. And so what we find here is this incredible study of contrast. There is a contrast of purpose, the purpose of return. We're going to see a different purpose for returning for Naomi than there is for Ruth. There's going to be a study in the contrast of perspective, the perspective that Naomi has, the perspective that Ruth has, and subsequently those around them. There's also a contrast of provision, what God has provided versus what Naomi thinks she has provided, what Ruth brings to the table. So this is a huge study of contrast, still in this first chapter, still as the storyteller's unfolding the story for us, and still dealing with the whole return to a covenant relationship with God, one that we've seen in the first 14 verses that Naomi has walked away from. And we've talked at length about Naomi walking away from this and walking out of the land of blessing and walking to the wash pot, away from the house of bread, walking out of the blessings. But now we saw in the next series of verses, we saw 9 times this little word shuv show up, this word to return, to return, to return. And it's God calling Naomi to return back to the land of blessing, return back to this covenant relationship, return back to who she is as a child of Yahweh, and to bring with her those who are with her. Because as we saw last week, this bond of marriage that Orpah makes is a stronger bond with her husband into Naomi's family than it is to her own family. This bond, in God's eyes, this bond that Ruth makes to her husband, though their husbands are dead, that bond of this new family is a stronger bond than is the bond of her old family. That's how serious God takes a number of things. He takes marriage seriously. He takes a vow that we make, and we're going to see this very distinctly in this vow that Ruth is going to make. He takes these things very, very seriously, especially coming out of these covenant promises that God has made. So when we last returned, the last verse we looked at, Orpah and Ruth, they lift up their voices, they weep, and Orpah is going to return, but Ruth is going to cling. We saw that little word, that little Hebrew word, dabath, meaning literally to cling to cleave to. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. This is where a mother leaves a son leaves the father and mother and cleaves to his wife. That is the word. It is the same Hebrew word here that Ruth clings or cleaves to Naomi, because that bond is that strong in the covenant relationship. So we start here in verse 15, and I just got to tell you, the way the storyteller continues to unfold this story, you have to look at almost every word to see what he is unfolding for us. So here's where we start in verse 15. And she, Naomi, said, "Look, your sister-in-law. Now, who's she connecting Ruth with? She's connecting Ruth with Orpah, sister-in-law. These are sister-in-laws by marriage. There is that depth of relationship. But she says your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. I just got to stop you there for a minute. Was this a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
This was a bad thing for Orpah to return to her people and her gods. Why? Who was the god of Moab? Do you remember? His name was Chemosh. He was the primary god of Moab. And what did Chemosh demand?
Sacrifice your firstborn.
Sacrifice. He was the god of fertility, so you had to sacrifice the first of everything that you had in order for this wooden image to bless you with fertility, to bless you with more children, and to bless you with more crops. So Naomi says, go back to your people and your gods. And I want you to hear, just keep your finger there. I'm going to go back to Deuteronomy for just a minute. And I want you to hear what God says about this. This is Deuteronomy chapter 13. It's in your notes. But I want you to hear what God says about this and just listen to what he's talking about. Verse 6. This is Deuteronomy 13, verse 6. If your brother, the son of your mother, your son or your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, of the gods of the people which are all around you, near or far to you, from one end of the earth to the other, you shall not consent to him or listen to him. Nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him. Now, what God is saying here is, if somebody outside or even inside draws your attention to other gods, if someone pulls your attention to other gods, entices you away from the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, and Joseph, if someone entices you away from God, don't spare him, don't conceal him, don't pity him. And as a matter of fact, God says the punishment for somebody turning you away from Yahweh, the punishment on that person shall be, you shall kill him. This was a very serious thing because God was bringing his nation into a land that he wanted his nation for himself. And remember, this is the time of the judges. This cyclical event was going on. And there were numerous influences being played into the nation of Israel. But what God was telling his people is, if anyone entices you away from me, have nothing to do with them. Now, take that into consideration of what has Naomi just done. What has Naomi just done to Orpah, and what has Naomi just done to Ruth? Where she told him to go.
Orpah away, yeah.
I told him to go away.
That's right. She has just done exactly what the Mosaic law says. Not only do you not do, but if anybody does this, you have the right, and the punishment and the penalty is fairly severe. It's incredibly severe. In fact, he concludes this by saying, you shall stone him until he dies, because he sought to entice you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. Basically, what he's saying is this: God, who has done all these incredible things for you, you would listen to someone who would entice you away from me rather than someone who would bring you to me. Mm-hmm. This is how serious the scenario is here for Naomi. Look, sister-in-law, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. You need to do the same thing. The Mosaic law says that's a huge, huge no. You just don't do this. The nation of Israel was called to be the ones that glorified God. They were called to be the ones that were to show people who God is and to turn their attention toward him, not to turn them away. And yet here are these two women who have been bonded in marriage to Naomi, and she's telling them, go back to your gods. You see the contrast? You see how big this is? Now, do I think Naomi's a bad person?
No.
Not by any stretch. Do I think she's evil? Not by any stretch. Do I think she's a woman who is incredibly unbelievably discouraged, downhearted, thinks there's no hope? Do I think she, by worldly wisdom, says, if I look at all the cards on the table, your best bet for happiness is to go back to your gods and your people because that's where you can be married, that's where you can have children, that's where there's still food. Don't come with me. Stay there. Do I think she's doing that out of just the hurt that's in her? Absolutely. I don't think she's bad because let's think about it. Ruth, as we're going to see in a minute, has heard about Yahweh from somebody, and it's more than likely she's heard about Yahweh from Naomi, probably in better times. But right now, the contrast is she's telling her two daughters-in-law, where God is saying, return to me, she's saying, no, return to your homeland. And what we've seen is, by the Mosaic Law, this was a big, big no-no. And we asked this question last week, do I, by my actions, by the things that I say, am I leading people to the Lord or am I turning them away? Naomi is still following in this. Go back to your gods and to your people, return after your sister-in-law. Now, you see verse 16 where Naomi is saying, return to what the New Testament tells us. In fact, in Romans 1, it tells us that's death, that apart from God, this is death, when we should be drawing them to God, where there is life. The first word in verse 16 is what? But. That's a contrast. So here comes a contrast, huge contrast. We've already seen the beginning of this, the contrast that Orpah returns and Ruth doesn't. The contrast that Naomi says, go back to your gods because there's no hope for you where I'm going. But Ruth said this. Now, I want to walk this through with you because there are many biblical scholars who feel this is perhaps the most beautiful passage of all of Scripture. We've seen, and if you know some of the older traditions, this is actually a wedding vow. And God takes a vow very, very seriously. In fact, Deuteronomy 23 tells us how serious God takes a vow. In fact, what he says is, if a vow comes from your lips, you will keep that promise. So this is a vow coming from Ruth, who is going to cling to Naomi, that wedding statement, that marriage statement. This is Ruth who is clinging to Naomi in that fashion because she recognizes how tight this bond is. And here's what she says. Where's Orpah gone? Here's the contrast. Where's Orpah gone? She's left. Ruth now says, I'm going to cling to you. And here's what she says. Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. So I beg you, do not make me go away from you. Who right now understands the covenant relationship, Ruth or Naomi?
Ruth.
Yes, the outcast, the Moabitess, who has heard about Yahweh, obviously from Naomi, now is standing stronger in this relationship with Yahweh than is Naomi. She says, don't make me leave you or turn back from you. Now, here's what we're going to get. I want you to see the levels of depth of commitment that Ruth makes to Naomi. Watch these levels of commitment. So here's the commitment. First, wherever you go, I will go. So I'm going to be your traveling companion. This is the first level of commitment. And it's an easy level of commitment because Ruth can break off at any time. She can say, I'm done with this. I'm finished. I'm going to stop following you. I'm going to leave. But we have a first level of commitment that says, I'm going to travel with you. Then she says, wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Wherever you make a home, I will make a home. Now that's the second level of commitment. And it's a deeper level because once she's under the roof, it's a little bit harder to walk away being under the roof, same roof. But now she gets even more deep. Your people shall be my people. Your nation will be my nation. The people that you surround yourself with, I will now be adopted into, grafted into your people. I will become a part of your people. Now, think about this, and I'm just going to make a very quick spiritual connection. We Gentiles, when Christ died on the cross, what happened to us? We were grafted in. We were adopted in as sons and daughters because of the work of Jesus. Can you identify with Ruth right now? Mm-hmm. She's saying the exact same thing. that Christ has said to us, in me, you have been adopted in, you have been grafted into the family of God. Ruth says, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to lodge with you. Your people will be my people. And here's the really key phrase. Your God will be my God. She uses the word Yahweh here. This is the word that's used for the covenant-keeping God of Israel. She makes the statement to Naomi, not only will I follow you, not only will I make a home with you, not only will your people be my people, but Yahweh will be my God. I'm going to turn away from Chemosh. I'm going to turn away from my gods. And remember the contrast in verse 15. Where's Orpah gone? She's gone back to her gods and her people. Ruth has just made this incredible commitment. I'm going to be a part of your family. I'm going to be a part of your people. I'm going to go where you go. And Yahweh's going to be my God. Why do you think she says this? Why do you think she let's be real honest here. We've been talking about Naomi. Would you follow after Naomi right now?
Well,
Really?
Yeah. The way she's been talking, the way she's been acting, the way she's been, and what she's going to get ready to say here when she comes into Bethlehem, I kind of have some of those questions about Ruth. Seriously? You're wanting to follow after this woman? Well, let's ask the question, who's she actually wanting to follow after?
Yahweh.
Yahweh. That's because, and I'll say it again, I think Naomi has given her this beautiful picture of Yahweh, and there's probably running in Ruth's mind this little question of, why don't you believe this? Why aren't you desiring to get back to Yahweh, get back to the blessing, get back to that? Why aren't you there? Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Verse 17, and where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Now, that's a huge statement, because what she says is, when I'm with you till death do us part. Sound familiar? That's where we get it from. Till death do us part. And when I'm going to be buried, don't send me back to Moab, to that place to be buried. I'm going to be buried where you're buried. That's how closely I'm going to be identified with your people. That's how closely I'm going to be immersed into your culture, into your family, and into your God. Now, just so you understand this, the word baptism, which is not here, but it's where we get the concept from. Baptism literally means to be immersed into, to be so identified with that you cannot tell the difference. Here's the way we describe it. If you take a piece of white cloth and baptize it into purple dye, when it comes out, what color is it?
Purple.
Purple. It's not white dyed purple. It's now identified with that color. It is now purple. It's been immersed, and it now identifies. When we are immersed into Christ, we now identify with him. Here's what she is saying. I want to be so identified with you that when I die, I'm going to be buried where you're buried, because that you are now my people, your God is my God, and nothing, including death, will separate me from that connection, that vow with you. In fact, what she says is, the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. The Lord take me if I go back on this vow. Now, again, you go to Deuteronomy 23, the vow she's making here is actually a wedding vow. Don't take that politically incorrect today. This is a vow of connection. It's a vow of commitment. It's a vow of purpose for her to be connected to Naomi's people and Naomi's God, because she understands what the wedding vow did in connecting her into that family. So she uses the name Yahweh. She says, this is my commitment and my vow. God says in Deuteronomy, you make a vow with your lips, you better hold to that vow. And that's where Ruth is. We have this huge contrast. This is the vow she's made. And I would bet somewhere in Naomi's background, she made a similar vow as a child of God to Yahweh, but she has walked away from that. Now, this is an incredible statement. She begins to return to Yahweh. She's made the commitment to come back to Bethlehem. And what has God provided her?
Ruth.
What's God provided Naomi right now? Ruth. Who has faith and who doesn't? Ruth has faith. Naomi doesn't. God has provided an outcast Moabite daughter-in-law to bring faith back to Naomi. Can God use anything?
Yes.
God can use anything to bring his plan to bear. So we get this beautiful statement where Ruth is recognizing where life is, and she wants to follow Naomi back to where life is. So she makes this beautiful vow of marriage. And by the way, this is very reminiscent of the Abrahamic covenant, where God said to Abraham, "Go to the land I'll show you." What God didn't say was, "Abraham, go down about 2 miles, take a right-hand turn, go down to the grove of trees, take a left-hand turn, walk another 50 miles, and you'll land in the land." That's the land. He said, "No, go, and I'm going to show you the land. At some point in time, I'm going to show you the land I'm sending you to." And Abraham makes a commitment to God to go. Ruth makes a commitment to God to go follow Naomi. Isn't this just beautiful? Don't you just go, wow, that's incredible. And we, by the way, celebrate this even today. We celebrate this covenant vow, this wedding vow that Ruth makes. We celebrate this even today. So we see this contrast of purpose, the purpose that she is coming back, the purpose that Naomi is coming back. Well, why? Let me ask you that. Why do you think Naomi's coming back?
Food.
Food.
For food.
Only one reason. Naomi's only coming back because there's food. Why do you think Ruth is coming back?
God.
God. It's following
Okay.
Yahweh.
Now let's take this even further. Ruth is coming. Does she have a home?
No.
Does she have a husband?
No.
Does she have a prospect of food or children?
No.
She's in the exact same place that Naomi is. And she could easily be saying, "God, you did this to me." But Ruth says, "I'm going to cling to you, Naomi. Your people are going to be my people. Your God's going to be my God, and nothing but death will part us." She makes this incredible vow of faith to follow after Yahweh. And it's a commitment that is so strong. In fact, what we see it here, verse 18, when she saw that she was determined, when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now, that doesn't mean she didn't have conversation with her. It basically means she stopped saying, "No, go back, go back, go back." She gave up. She saw the determination in Ruth to follow after her, the commitment of Ruth to Yahweh and ultimately to her and ultimately to Yahweh. And it was so strong that she stops telling Ruth to go back home. And she decides, "Okay, you can come with me." Now let's look again. This contrast of returning. Naomi only has one reason she's returning right now. She's heard there's food. Ruth has multiple reasons to return. God, family, home, roof overhead, and the possibility of food, and a commitment and a vow that she has made to this relationship. This is huge. And so what we see is that there is a purpose to return. The purpose of return, it's very simple. The purpose of return is this: to be in fellowship with the God of the universe, to be in fellowship with the God who brings life. The purpose to return is to be in fellowship with the God who calls us to return to him because he has our best, because he knows what's best for us. And that's to be close to him, to be intimate with him, to be in relationship with him. You got where we are so far? Beautiful statement, incredible. Let me ask you this question. If you were Ruth, would you make this commitment? Pretty significant statement of faith, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Okay, let's look at a contrast in perspective now. Wow. So they come back to Bethlehem, and as we know, it's just kind of on the other side of the Red Sea. They're walking back around. The two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. So they've left Moab, the washpot, the garbage dump, and they've come to the house of bread. Just that statement alone is a huge improvement. And it happened when they'd come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Now, who's excited?
The women.
The women.
The women, her friends, the women of the city. They're excited that is she excited she's returning?
No.
They're excited she's returning. Is God providing community already for her?
Yes.
She's not ready to receive it yet, but God's already providing family, home, community. And as we're going to see, he's going to continue to provide for her because she has returned. Now, a couple lines of scholarship on this statement. Is this Naomi? 10 years.
10 years. She'd been gone 10
She's
years.
been gone 10 years.
For the whole time. That's okay. So
Yes.
she'd look a little the same.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, here's that great statement. Here, have you ever been to a high school reunion?
Yes.
High school reunion. Okay.
Uh-huh.
What you see in high school reunions is this. At your 10-year reunion, everybody kind of still looks the same.
Yeah.
At your 20-year reunion, there's a little more around the middle and a little less on the top of the head, at least for the guys. I'll say it that way. At the 30-year reunion, there are certain people that they may walk right past you and you may never recognize them. Think about this. She's been gone 10 years. Has it been an easy 10 years for Naomi?
No.
Have you ever made the reference that if you look at a president who's been in office
Yes.
for 8 years, look at what he looks like when he's in office and when he leaves?
Yes.
The stress and the strain, you've got to look different. It shows on your face.
That's
So the two lines of scholarship are this. The first is that the women look at her and go, "Is this Naomi?" In other words, the stress and the strain has been so great on her, they don't even recognize her. But the other school of scholarship is this. Is this Naomi? Is she really back? Now, I kind of land on the second one, that this is the contrast of the women who were looking at Naomi and saying, "She's finally come back. Is this Naomi? She's really come back." And the contrast that we see here is that the women are incredibly excited that Naomi is coming back, but Naomi's not. She hasn't yet seen the perspective of what God is providing over and over and over again, and the provision of these women who are her friends, who she has left, who have stayed in the land and are still there, still surviving, even through a famine. They're here waiting for her. So is this really Naomi come back to us? That's the line I take. That's the Mark Ray paraphrase of this. You can take the other one and say they could actually look at her and go, "I don't even recognize you, Naomi," which could also be true. But needless to say, she comes back and she's now standing in the midst of her people. And you would hope that she would be really excited to see these women. But here's what we say. Here's what she says, verse 20. But, there's that little word, the contrast word, but. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi." Now, what does her name mean in Hebrew?
Pleasant.
Pleasant. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. That's the Hebrew word for bitter. Now, look at what she says. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Let's look at the perspective here. Don't call me pleasant. My namesake, call me bitter. Because God has dealt bitterly with me. And then look at verse 21, because this to me says it all. "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home empty." Now let's just talk about this for a minute. I went out full. So in Naomi's mind right here, based on the text, in Naomi's mind, Who's the one that provided everything for Naomi when she left? Look at the text. I went out full. I went out full. Who provided for her? She did. She's basically saying, I had everything. I had a husband, I had children, I had food, I had a family, I had I had it. But God took it all away from me. Now let's remember who left the land when you're not supposed to. Who went to the place you weren't supposed to go to. Who let her sons marry who you weren't supposed to. Who tried to send her daughters-in-law back to where she wasn't supposed to. Excuse me? Who's dealt bitterly with whom here? I went out full. This is the me. I had it all, but God, you did it. This again, we go back to the garden, and Adam looking at God and saying, "You're the one that gave me the woman. It's your fault." So we get this contrast. First of all, the women are excited for her return. She's not. Second, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. Third, I went out full. God brought me back empty. He's the one that did this to me. If he would have just left me alone, I would have been just fine in the garbage dump. I went out full. He brought me home empty. I'm not at fault. God is. God's the one to blame for my situation and me being bitter. Now, I want to just ask you a sideline question here. When she says, I went out full, but the Lord brought me home empty, who's standing right beside her?
Ruth.
Has God brought her back empty?
No.
Has God provided even an outcast Moabite woman who now has committed unbelievably this vow of commitment to her, to walk beside her, to be there with her? Has God provided abundantly in the person of Ruth?
Yes.
Is she empty by any stretch?
No.
She's walked back and Ruth is by her side. She's walked back. The women are excited to see her. She's come back because she's heard there's bread. She's acting right now as if there's no tikvah, as if there's no hope that God can't do a thing. And yet look at all the things that God has already done. He's already provided somebody for her. He's already begun to provide food for her. He's already provided her friends back, that community and fellowship back. He has provided, he has provided, he has provided. And who's walking back with faith and who's walking back with no faith? The outcast Moabitess has all the faith in the world. The child of God has none of it. I'll say it again. Romans chapter 1 tells us the farther we walk away from God, we can ultimately get to the point where we can't tell right from wrong. What we think is right is wrong, and what we think is wrong is right. Naomi has found herself, because she's walked for 10 years away from God, when she comes back and actually comes face to face with everything God is providing for her, she can't see it. She's walking in this, what's the word I'm looking for? This depression, but it's really, she's really brought it upon herself. And when she walks back in, she's not seeing the friends. She's not seeing Ruth. She's not seeing the home. She's not seeing any of this. She's wallowing in, that's the word I'm looking for. She's wallowing in just this great feeling of being able to blame God. Anybody ever been there?
Pity party.
Yep.
Anybody ever been there? Yeah. God, you did it. God, why me? God, this wasn't my fault. And yet the perspective that we see from Ruth's standpoint is the perspective of, I have a home. I have family. I have God. I have a place to belong. I have somebody I'm committed to. Ruth, this outcast, is seeing over and over again the beauty of what God is beginning to provide. And we're going to see that huge here, especially as we move into chapter 2. But the contrast of perspective says, here's the difference. And let me put it this way. Go back to the prodigal son. We talked about this last week and the week before. Prodigal son. He gets his inheritance. By the way, did he deserve his inheritance? Did he earn it?
No.
No. It's given to him. He takes it. And actually, if you really understand inheritance, what he was really telling his father is he wasn't supposed to get his inheritance till his father died. So when he demanded his inheritance, what is he actually telling his father? I wish you were
Dead.
dead. So he walks with his inheritance. Hold on just a minute. He walks with his inheritance, and he goes away and he squanders it. And while he squanders it, he finally recognizes, I would be better off back with my father. But there is a huge difference between his return and Naomi's return. His return has an attitude attached to it. What's that attitude? Repentance and
Humility.
has he been humbled by his experience? Is he coming back with an attitude of humility?
Yeah.
Is Naomi returning with an attitude of humility?
No.
Not by any stretch. Fast forward to Luke chapter 5, and you see when Peter throws out the nets, he's got this prideful attitude when Jesus says, toss your nets out on the other side. Okay, I don't think anything's going to happen, but if you will, pulls in this huge pot of fish, recognizes who Christ is, and he says, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. Christ basically then says, now I'm going to make you a fisher of men. Why? Because you've displayed the attitude that I can work with. The attitude that we return to God, especially when we've sinned, when we've walked away from him, when we have walked down that path, the attitude to return to him is not a defiant attitude of, Lord, it's your fault, you better make it right. It is the attitude of, Lord, I've sinned. Fellowship, please for me. That's the attitude that God can work with. It's the attitude of a moldable, pliable, shapeable person into the image of Jesus Christ. Does that make sense? That's why I keep saying, boy, do I see myself in Naomi. So Naomi went from being full to being empty. Interesting in contrast, Ruth went from being empty to being full. God has a desire to bless. He has a desire to bless over and over again. And the blessing that he begins to give Naomi is the person of Ruth, though she doesn't see it. The blessing for Ruth is the person of Naomi, and she recognizes it. The huge contrast of seeing what God has provided and actually looking for what God has provided. I got to tell you a quick story. Have I got time? Yes, I have time for this.
Yeah.
Many of you know, many of you may not know, I was a pastor, lead pastor at a church in Midland. Midland is West Texas. It's oil country. And when I first visited, they flew me in at early in the morning. It was still dark outside. And the old joke about Midland is if you're trying to recruit somebody, you fly them in under the cover of darkness so they can't actually see the city. It sits in the middle of the desert. There's not a whole lot of pretty to it. And I know I have some Midland friends who are looking in, so they've heard this story before. Had a great time my first time there. Went to church, met the people, came back, and the elders then asked Melissa, my wife, and me to come, and we decided to drive this time. When you drive into Midland, you drive in on a road called Garden City Highway. Now, let me just tell you, that's a misnomer. There's nothing Garden City about it. About an hour outside, you hit a town called Eden. It's not. You hit a town called Sterling City. It's not. You hit a town called Garden City. It's really not. And then about 7 miles outside of town, you hit a landfill. It is. It is. And the way you get into town, you come into Garden City Highway, you take a right coming up a road called Fairgrounds. Fairgrounds is really, at least at the time that we were there, it was about the farthest point east of the city, and it was an entire chain link fence all the way down Fairground. And the winds in West Texas blow all the time. And every single bit of trash is up against this chain link fence. We turned on the fairgrounds, which, by the way, if you're recruiting somebody to come to Midland, don't tell them to drive this way to get into town. And my wife looked at me and she said, what apocalyptic event occurred in this town that we missed? Well, here was the deal. We came to Midland and we came to Midland from Austin. We were looking for beauty.
Oh.
And God has not visited Midland in obvious beauty. But I will tell you, it took about 6 months, and we began to see things like unbelievable sunrises. And what we learned was the dirt in the air creates incredible colors in the sunrise. And so you began to give thanks for the dirt in the air because the sunrises are the most spectacular I've ever seen. Same with the sunsets. We began to see things that popped up through the ground, plants, unique plants that popped up through the ground that you would think there is no reason why that plant should actually grow here. We saw incredible stars at night. But I think the most unbelievable expression of God's beauty in that place were the people we got to know. We got to know a group of people that God blessed us with a church and blessed us with a group of people that were just phenomenal. They invested in us, we invested in them, and God gave us this unbelievable beauty in the people, but it took recognition. It took a perspective shift on our part to be able to see that beauty around us. What we see here with Naomi and Ruth is that Ruth has that perspective shift. The perspective of return for Ruth is that she is in fellowship with a good God who desires to bless abundantly, and she's looking for those blessings. Naomi's perspective is still, God's not good. He's dealt with me bitterly. He's dealt with me angrily. Listen to what she says again. He brought me home empty. He's testified against me, and he has afflicted me. Now, that perspective shift says God's not a good God. Look at all that he's done to me, and yet we know who's the one that walked away, who's the one that walked outside the blessing. So what the return says is when you return to God, return with a different perspective. The perspective here is that you're returning to a good God who desires to bless you. And many times we have that blessing, but I guarantee if your perspective, first and foremost, this is a good God who has my good at heart, you're going to start to look for the blessing that he has placed around you. So we get this beautiful view of God, and we ask the question, do I begin to view God through what he has provided or what I don't have? How do I look at God? Do I look at God by virtue of what he's provided and I see the abundant blessing around me? Or do I look at God as a God who hasn't provided what I think I deserve, what I think I should have? Do you see that perspective shift? Now, the beautiful thing about Naomi is she returned. Amen. High five. Way to go, Naomi. She returned. But she's returned still with a perspective that isn't seeing God's abundant blessing around her. Because let's face it, what does she now have? She has Ruth. She's returned home. She has friends. And listen to what verse 22 says. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem when? At the beginning of the harvest. So what's this? What are the two things you have to have to survive?
Food and shelter.
Food and children.
Children.
What does she now have hope of?
Food, for sure.
Food. God's providing. Now, I got to take you here. This is so much fun. Look very quickly at verse 22. And I want you to see how incredible this storyteller is. Verse 22 starts with these words. So Naomi returned. All right? Now, Naomi, just a verse before, 2 verses before in verse 20 said, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara.
Mara.
So what you don't see the storyteller say is, so Mara returned. He's not giving her any ground here. The storyteller says, so Naomi returned, because she's returned to the place that can reestablish for her namesake. She's coming back to the land of blessing. Look at what else he says. He says, she's returned, and Ruth, now look at how Ruth is described. Look at this beautiful statement. Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law. You see the contrast? She's the outcast you should have nothing to do with, and yet she is the daughter-in-law. And by the way, she's the daughter-in-law who is going to help return to Naomi her namesake of being pleasant. This is what God has provided. Ruth sees it. Naomi doesn't yet, but now he keeps going. Who returned from the country of Moab, returned from the garbage dump, and they came to the house of bread right at the start of the barley harvest. Is God good or what?
Amen.
Look at what he's provided to Naomi. He's provided home. He's provided friends. He's provided Ruth, a woman of faith. He's provided over and over again, and now he's providing food. What's he provided for Ruth, the outcast? A home, family, a people, food. And what he's provided to both of them, though only one recognizes it right now, he's provided himself. He has said, I am your God. I will not leave you or forsake you. The blessing is in the land, and when you return, I'll be there to bless you. Now let's face it, Naomi had walked away. Was God still in calling her back? Was that still a blessing in calling her to return?
Yes.
God hadn't left her.
No.
She just had to finally listen to him saying, return to me, come back to me. So we get this beautiful picture of this, which I now call, this is the contrast of provision. And the contrast of provision says this, that Naomi has returned. She's returned from the garbage dump to the house of bread. This is what God has provided. The child of God has returned. Ruth has returned from absolute underneath an idol, this idol worship, this horrible place, and has returned with Naomi to land, house, family, potential friends, food. And the significance of Naomi, who is now beginning in her return to move from bitter to pleasant, we now see Ruth moving from Moabitess to daughter of the king, to daughter-in-law. The beauty of what this storyteller does in just unfolding this is great. So here's a question. Has Naomi returned physically to the land?
Yes.
Has she returned spiritually to God?
Not yet.
Has Ruth returned physically to the land?
Yes.
Has she returned spiritually to Yahweh?
Yes, indeed.
Beautiful picture of these two. And the question is this, to what length will God go to get you to return to him when you walk away? That's how much God loves you. That's how much he desires to bless you. He will go to incredible lengths to get you to return to him where the blessing is. I want to conclude with an application here. I want you to see the purpose of return, the purpose of the perspective of return, the provision of return. I want you to see what these mean in kind of an overview. You've got these in your notes, but I want to walk it through with you real quick. The purpose of return. The reason we return is to be close to the God of the universe, the God of majesty, the God of glory. We return because the God of the universe desires us to be in deep relationship. Now think about this for a minute. The God of the universe wants you and me to be in a deep relationship with him. Doesn't that sound like a place you'd want to return to?
Yes.
Why? He is the God of love, the God of grace, and the God of blessing, and he desires to bless his creation with abundant life that is not only for eternity, but also is abundant life now. This is why you return, because the God of the universe desires to bless, and the place to bless is when you're close to him. So the purpose of return is to be close to God, to be in intimate relationship with this God of the universe. The perspective of return says this. The perspective of return is to see and understand that he is a good God to the depths of his very being, and that being with him is far better than being away from him. Think about just for a moment, if Naomi had stayed in the land, though there was a famine, who's she still close to? God. That's far better than being away from him, because he is a good God. The perspective of return says, I return to him because he is good and he wants my best. That's why, because he is the one who loves us unconditionally, works continually for our good, both now and for all eternity. The purpose of return is to be close to him. The perspective of return is I'm close to him because he's a good God who wants my best, who desires my best. And the provision of return, to know the provision of God for us is his son, Jesus Christ. It's the provision of grace that through Christ's work on our behalf, we can be in fellowship with the God of the universe, both now and in eternity. The provision of return is Jesus Christ. That's the provision through whom we return to God. No one comes to the Father but through me. Because Christ loves us and desires an intimate relationship with us and has provided the way for return, resulting in life today and in eternity. So get this understanding of what we're talking about with Naomi and we're talking about with Ruth here. They return and we return to God to be close to him. The perspective of return says we want to be close to him because he's a good God who wants our best. And the way we do that, the provision of that return, is through his son, Jesus Christ. That, in a nutshell, is what we're talking about here. But the contrast of Ruth and Naomi, how they return, the contrast is magnificent. It is huge in the differences between the two and the attitude between the two. So here's my question to you, and the way we want to end this morning is this. When God provides, how do I respond? Do I respond to God's provision like Naomi or like Ruth? Do I respond to God's provision in my life by seeing it, recognizing it, grateful for it, humbles me because the God of the universe is doing this? Do I recognize it in that perspective like Ruth does, or do I recognize it like Naomi? I deserve it. It's what you should have given me. How do I respond to God's provision, to God's abundant blessing in my life? How do I respond to it? Do I respond like Naomi, or do I respond like Ruth? It's a huge contrast. And my prayer is that when we recognize God's blessings on our life, we respond like Ruth does. That's our response. We become Ruths, including the guys. Is John over there? I can't see. Is John on
John's
there?
there.
Hey, John, you can be a Ruth.
Okay, I'll be Ruth.
But we'll get a good Naomi, or we'll get a good Boaz in there too. So
There he is.
there he is. Way to go, John. So that kind of concludes where we are this morning. We've just finished chapter 1. Let me open it up. Questions, comments, thoughts. There's a series of questions that I put at the end of each of these study guides that are really there to provide additional conversation and maybe some during the week reflection. But love to open the door. Are there questions, thoughts, comments, things that need to be said that you want to share?
Come on, y'all. We got time. And we've got the master teacher, the rabbi.
That's a scary thought.
No, it's true. Anybody?
I have a question or a comment of in Ruth's pledge to vow to Ruth to Naomi, that Naomi is stuck in her bitterness, and yet she pledges her life to her.
Yes.
Naomi hasn't changed one bit. And how would you contrast that in real life? How would you apply that?
That's a
Well,
good question.
Let's first of all remember this. There is one way in which Naomi has changed. She's now headed back toward God. Whether she knows it or not, she's headed back. She's at least headed back toward the land.
Mhm.
That's a huge shift for Naomi.
Mhm.
But the application would give is this: are we looking for God's blessing? Because let's face it, what Ruth is seeing God's abundant covenant blessing in Naomi. And the question is, are we seeing that? What Naomi doesn't recognize is God's covenant blessing in giving her Ruth. This is God's covenant blessing of caring for the widows and the orphans. She's a widow. She's got nothing left. And God has provided this incredible woman of faith for her. For Ruth, God is providing for Ruth in Naomi, and we've seen it. This is why she pledges herself to her God, to her land, to her people, to go where she goes. But again, it goes back to, and my application here is, do I recognize the blessings of God in my life? If God is a good God, and I'm to stay close to him, do I recognize his blessings in my life? And if I do, how do I respond to them? Again, my prayer is that we respond like Ruth. I mean, we commit ourselves even deeper, even further to him, because we see his abundant blessing on us. And so we respond that way rather than responding like Naomi. I'll say it again. It's like what you see in the Garden of Eden. God says, here's the entire garden for you. Just don't do this one thing. And the focus and the attention is on the one thing I can't have rather than the abundant blessing. God has abundantly blessed Naomi. And yet in her mind, she focuses on the one thing. God, you took all this away from me. Rather than, God, look at what you've given me. And contrast this with Job. Job was sifted. All was lost. And yet his faith still remained intact to God. So I see a huge application here for us. Do I, number one, recognize God's blessing in my life? And number two, how do I respond to that blessing? Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yes, you've helped me sort that out, that with Ruth, her focus was on Yahweh.
Yes.
Naomi's focus is on herself. And so when we have a family member who is bitter, stuck, what's our focus? Is it focus on Yahweh, God, and his provisions, so it doesn't, which is hard to do, not affect the bitterness in a family member,
Right.
but focus on God of provision.
Well, and what you're going to see, it's a beautiful nature of Ruth. Throughout chapter 2 and chapter 3, Ruth goes about doing what the covenant promises. She's done it here. She's done it here in chapter 1. She makes the covenant promise. This is what God said to do, and I'm going to go do that. God said take care of the widows and the orphans. I'm going to do that. God said your marriage is stronger to Naomi than it is to your family. I'm going to stay with her. And what we're going to see in chapter 2 is she goes out in the field and gleans, because that's God's provision for the widows and the orphans and the poor. The interesting part is, begin chapter 2, Ruth is out in the field doing the work. Where's Naomi?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She's still in the house sulking because God hasn't provided. And yet who's out there bringing her food? Who's out there providing?
In the heat.
Pretty significant contrast. So yes, I agree. Again, where's my focus? Where's my focus?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you can apply that to relationships. Then when there's conflict too, if you focus on how this person hurt me or something like that, instead of going back to focus on how God wants me to deal with this.
Well, I think it's a great point. I think if you would also look at the fact that we're in spiritual battles all the time. And many times what's behind a conflict is nothing more is a spiritual battle. There is a spiritual battle going on. And so how I respond to that in that conflict can make a huge difference in how that person views God and how it affects them, and maybe even bringing them back into that relationship. I don't want to launch into biblical counseling here, but don't forget that there's a spiritual battle that does rage in this. The spiritual battle is for the very soul of people, and how we respond in difficult circumstances, just like you see here. Would you rather be in relationship with Ruth right now or Naomi?
Yes.
With Ruth, of course.
No, Naomi comes back and says, "Hey, get away from me. Don't call me anything but bitter, because God has dealt bitterly with me." And yet here's Ruth by her side going, "Hey, I'm going to go out and do what God says to do." Right now, I'd rather be in a relationship with Ruth, because she's the one who is actually walking in obedience. She's the one who's putting forth the glory of God, not Naomi. Great questions. Other thoughts?
I'm just really kind of curious, and the text doesn't really have much to say about it, but I'm thinking that Naomi may have been very much influenced by her husband before he died. I mean, this isn't just about Naomi and Ruth. I mean, there's some unknowns there, but I think maybe there was a good bit of maybe positive influence from the father-in-law, maybe brother-in-law, and her husband before they died. I don't know. But it seems like
we
Naomi
talked about
was
this.
just it seems like Naomi was just along for the ride. And I'm wondering,
we talked about this. Yeah, we talked about this. We talked about this first week. Here's the difficulty, and I do agree. Elimelech's name was God. My God is King. Obviously, there is this relationship, but you see a very significant contrast between human wisdom and godly wisdom. A famine in the land, by human wisdom, says go where there's food. But the godly wisdom says famine in the land, there's a reason why God's doing what he's doing. Stay in the land. That's where the blessing is. And by the way, don't in any way, shape, or form go to Moab. Now, I can see Naomi goes with Elimelech. But once they're in the land, Elimelech dies and Naomi stays 10 more years. Here's what I would say. The connecting point would be, if I was Naomi, and I'd love to be able to say this, I probably wouldn't, but I'd love to be able to say this. Elimelech dies, I'm hightailing it right back to where my family is, my land is, my relatives are, where all of that exists. I'm not staying in the land of the washpot, the land of the garbage dump, for 10 more years. So I do, but Betty, what I do agree with is I think there was a tremendous influence on Ruth that came from Naomi. Some of it may have come from Elimelech. The text doesn't tell us. We get Elimelech in the first verse, and basically by verse 2, he's gone. But I would also say this. What we're going to find in chapter 2 is that there is a relative of Elimelech who is this incredible man of God named Boaz. Do we think that there was an influence somewhere? Yes. And I think the influence maybe of Elimelech on Naomi, the influence of Naomi definitely on Ruth. I think those are all at play in here, though the text doesn't give that to us. What the text gives us is they made very human choices that went against what God said to do. Now, the beautiful thing about it is, and I love this, it's the minute Naomi says, I'm going to return, even if it's for the wrong reason, I'm going to return because there's food, God begins to bless again. He begins to bless with the hope of food. He begins to bless with Ruth coming alongside. And he's continuing to do this. And jumping way ahead, there's a huge reason And the ultimate reason is that through Boaz and Ruth is going to come the continued line of the seed of David. All that's going to happen. And God has a huge purpose in mind for them all to return to Bethlehem. But the ones who recognize it right now, Naomi's just walking in this, oh, poor, pitiful me. I can't see beyond what God has done to me. Where Ruth is saying, you showed me who Yahweh is. I'm going to walk where Yahweh tells me to walk. Because I think what Ruth is, we don't see it in the text, but I think what Ruth is saying is, I'm going to do what you said, not what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a good one. Mhm.
But yeah, I do think there was probably some influence early on, but that influence has been gone for a good 10 years of Elimelech. So, good question, though. Other thoughts?
Sorry, I had to be in Austin the past 2 weeks. So I missed the first one.
We can give you the link to get them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was so
Just
busy, I couldn't even watch them online. I was grandkids helping with the newborn.
Any other questions, thoughts?
The influence of Jewish family comes through in this book so strongly. I mean, you have to, if you just kind of let your mind and your heart think about what it was that Elimelech did in taking his family away from the promised land,
Mhm.
because he thought he could provide obviously better than God did. That must have been there. But that God's purpose was carried out in spite of that,
Yes.
and because of that, in spite of that. And yet, and the role of a mother-in-law in the Jewish family is pretty strong, I think. The culture comes through there. And these Moabite women that became her daughters-in-law had to have seen the contrast between
Sure.
what she and this family were like and what they had come from. So I think as we think about this, that today our families, which are in a evolving place because of the nature of life today and everything, it is so comforting to realize that if we have our eyes on God, He takes care of the rest of it. And then that's the point.
Well, you get this really beautiful look when you look at somebody like Timothy in the New Testament, and you see the influence of mother and grandmother on Timothy in rounding out his faith. Imagine, I'm just going to take you forward here into chapter 2. You run into Boaz. Imagine if Elimelech had stayed in the land. What lessons could have been taught about the God of the universe being faithful because you're sitting in the covenant promise that He is going to provide? Imagine what could have been taught about who God is, His goodness. Because what we're going to see is Boaz stayed. And the effect on Boaz is that God blesses, He multiplies. And yeah, were there some hard times? Yeah, I bet there were hard times. But God has provision for all of this. And so the beauty of imagine what would have happened to a Naomi if she had stayed in the land. I would venture to guess the cultural influence from Moab on Naomi is also one of the things that turned her bitter. She'd been 10 years in a foreign land, 10 years under a different God, and that changes you. So she comes back, and now she begins, and we're going to see it. At the end of chapter 3, she's going to make this incredible statement about let the Redeemer do His work. Rest in the Redeemer. And it's the first time we're going to see this from Naomi and go, she finally gets it. She's landed back in as the woman of faith we always knew she was. But it's been buried under this weight of all of this yuck that she's been in. And it's finally when she begins to clear the decks and God begins to show her abundant blessing after abundant blessing. We get to chapter 3, and all of a sudden she goes, okay, God's at work. Let Him work, which is exactly what you're saying. It's going to be a beautiful statement. I can't wait to unfold that, because we finally get to see, and I think a Jewish audience would have gone, Naomi, yeah, you're back. Yeah.
Good.
Any other thoughts?
Wait. Anybody
Thank
else?
you. Just thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
You bet.
We are really grooving on all of this. We have 22 people here today.
That's wonderful. Well, we're going to tackle, just so you know, read ahead. We're going to tackle chapter 2, the first 13 verses. And this now becomes, we're now entering into a new phase in the storytelling. We're still going to have Naomi and Ruth, but we actually bring in Boaz. And this is going to bring in another person that's recognizing the covenant relationship of God and his nation. And we see that now we're going to see the contrast of a guy who actually stayed, and see what happens in this and how he reflects the covenant relationship. It's going to be a beautiful unfolding for this. So thank you all. Love being with you. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye.